Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. It is a pleasure to have you back as we proceed with Season 2 on the Seforim of Chaim Kanievsky. Season 2 has been dedicated in memory of Moshe Chaim and Yitzchak David by an anonymous donor. Again, as Rabbi Brut always says, many people reach out and ask to have shiurim on all kinds of topics. They're available. Reach out to myself, to Rabbi Brut, and we are happy to work on setting those up as well. So Rabbi Brut's going to start with a recap what we discussed last time. We started discussing the topic of using new Rishonim for manuscripts. We discussed Reb Chaim, his usage of them in Derech Emunah. That's where we see the most usage of manuscripts, new manuscripts from Rishonim. We started discussing a little bit what the Chazon Ish held about it, the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim, what he did. So we're going to recap where we ended off last time and continue from there. Looking forward. Right, Brett, how are you?
Okay, so basically, I'm going to recap what I'm trying to do this season, the beginning of the season, with what I did a little bit last week, what I'm going to do today, and some other episodes. As one learns through the Seforim of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, it keeps coming up. Besides his incredible bekias in all the Bavli, Rishalmi, etc., incredible knowledge in Rishonim, but just not just the standard Ritva, Rashba, Ramban. But appears he uses everything he gets his hands on that's Rishonim, even some manuscripts that were just printed or about to be printed. It's well known at the Chazon Ish, and we will discuss much greater length what exactly the Chazon Ish holds, but just for lack of anything else, just that he was anti-using new works of Rishonim. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky, who, as I've illustrated in the past season, is one of the greatest Talmidim of the Chazon Ish. It's funny that he's doing such a thing. Now, before taking a deep dive in, to understand the Chazon Ish Shita, I want to show, and I did already starting last week, was that Reb Chaim Kanievsky got this from the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was famous for bringing new Rishonim, and last week we discussed specifically his usage of the newly printed Zarua and the Meiri. Now, today I will hopefully get to is showing that it's not only the Chafetz Chaim, but there's other precedent for such things. Now, I began with two examples. I spoke last week was about the Zarua and the Meiri. So before going to the third example, just to tighten up a little bit more about what I spoke about. I mentioned that the Meiri gets bad flack. He's not, certain people, there's even Zilzaldik Lashonis about him. This is not a Zilzaldik Lashon, but a listener sent in from Reb David Soloveitchik a letter where he's specifically talking about the Meiri in Eruvin, that there's Devarim Mafliim, and he brings down from Admar Hagoyin Ha'imiti she'ein lo imun ba'meiri ha'chadashim shematbisim bezman ha'achron. He doesn't trust these Meiris. V'oisav oy tamal zeh di'eshem chadushim mafliim. There's too much great chadushim. Mashaloi matzinu kein zeh ba'meiri ha'yishalim she'eshem tachas yadeinu mizman. Well, earlier, there were some Meiris I've already mentioned already in the late 1700s. Some volumes start coming out, but this is a brisker Messiah. Now, I don't claim to be able to argue on Brisker Messiah. I don't come from that school, and I never heard. Where I come from, and my Rabbeim and different people do not go with such a shita. However, not only is the briskers, all briskers, say briskers of Eretz Yisrael, briskers of in America, seem to have held this sharp language. It seems I have heard also Rav Moshe Feinstein also was not so enamored with the Meiri. However, even if that is true, if one reads, for example, well recommended to read, Reb Zevin has a series of at least 5 reviews on various Masechtas of the Meiri that came out, or as I mentioned last week with Reb Zalman Orbach, some of the materials. If you read these reviews, you could begin to understand the importance of the Meiri B'chlal. There have been attempts by some people to put it down, but I'm not getting into that. One Mar Makam about this relating to Rav Moshe Feinstein is one of Rav Moshe Feinstein's greatest Talmidim was a Yid, Rav Nissen Alpert. Rav Nissen Alpert, interestingly enough, he put out the Meiri on Baba Metzia, with footnotes. And when you read the Hagdama, he writes how unbelievably important putting out the work specifically of the Meiri is. It's very strange. It's not strange. He writes amazing things about the Meiri, about the importance of it, the importance of learning in the Sugya. It's kedai to read the Lashonis. I'm not going to for lack of time, but at the end of the piece, he even says a lot of things I spoke over with who? With Ramosha Feinstein about this.
So before you tighten up the Zarua, how would a listener be able to differentiate? Let's say they want to follow this brisker Mesorah between a new Meiri and an old Meiri. See, I have on my shelf here this set of Meiri. There are other Meiris. Just basically describe what's the new and what's the old.
So it's that I as Chatoyini Maskir that I cannot explain, and I'm not familiar with the world of Brisk. The world of Brisk, I actually think that it will come out that most of the Meiris is not relevant for them, according to this. I guess maybe the Meiri on Megillah, I remember, is very early on, and a few other Masechtas, but most are not. So according to that, most of that set would not be relevant if someone's going with the Mesorah of Brisk. Okay, but anyway, as I said, we're not having an episode devoted to the Meiri specifically. It's well worth to study into the Meiri, all different aspects, but just to mention some opposition and a little bit more about it. Now, just to mention two other points relating to this, the Meiri, and relating also to the Zarua, randomly while looking into some other things, pulling out Lamashal, incredible, great Litvisha Gadol wrote a Tshuva Sefer called Tshuvas Amudei Eish. Not only is he a special Litvisha Gadol from 100 years ago or so, Rav Yosef was fascinated by the Sefer. You see, it had his Rabbi Yisrael Eisenstein, his name. Not so much is known about him. He was a Rav somewhere in Russia, but he had unbelievable Bekiyas. In the Sefer Amudei Eish, he quotes Meiri's often, new Rishonim, as we'll see more, but specifically Dar Zarua, and the same point that we mentioned last week of if you have a Magen of where Magen of Rams had asked questions on the Ramah, he says if you open up now that we were zeicha to have Dar Zarua, it helps understanding it. So we see in this Litvisha Gadol also similar to what I'm mentioning from the Chafetz Chaim. Another tremendous Litvisha Gadol, whose Sefer came out in 1904, which we're going to discuss a little bit more about him soon, is called Zichron Yonason, Tshuva Zichron Yonason, from a Reb Yonason Abelman. It's incredible Sefer in the Litvisha world. They say Chaim Shmulevitz knew it by heart. Anyway, he also, similar points, he uses the Meiri often, the ones that he had, and about the Zarua, he specifically has a tshuva where he talks about a Maram Mintz, and he talks about a Magen Avram, and he says basically that both the Maram Mintz and the Magen Avram didn't have the Zarua, and that's what caused them to have a wrong understanding. They were based on earlier quotes. Had one had the complete Zarua like we have, a lot more would come to light. Anyway, those are just some brief points. Obviously, a lot could be discussed on all that, and now we get to move on to our main part of today.
You had mentioned last time three. So you mentioned the Meiri, Zarua, and Rabbenu Chananel.
Right.
Rabbenu Chananel we find on the side of the Gemara. Rabbenu Chananel we find brought all over. I mean, it's brought in Rishonim, it's brought in Achronim. So what's with the Rabbenu Chananel?
Right. So Rabbenu Chananel is actually a very interesting story. I'm going to say it as brief as we could right now in the time that we have, and that is as follows. Rabbenu Chananel gets, and we're going to actually quote a beautiful piece, I hope shortly, from the Chazon Ish about the significance of Rabbenu Chananel. But Rabbenu Chananel is printed on the side of the Gemara, and we're going to discuss when it gets printed right now. So first, he dies in 1028. Okay, great. So it's pretty early. Now, this Sefer of Rabbenu Chananel is relatively new. When does it become available to us on the side of the Gemara? Only in the 1880s. Basically, when Shas Vilna is out when they finally get to publish their Shas, they try to get all different improvements, all whatever, if they get new materials, and they get one of the things they have on the side is Rabbenu Chananel and various Masechtas. Okay, we'll talk about that more in a minute. But before we get there, as you said, Rabbenu Chananel, when you learn Gemara, Rishonim, Taisvis, you come across his name rather often. But what's interesting is it's always from a cliche name. You say the Rishonim had such messiahs, but we never had a Sefer until the 1880s, pretty much. A little before, we don't have Rabbenu Chananel. Now, we don't have as it's called Kli Rishon of Rabbenu Chananel. Now, what happened is that already in the 1830s, the famous maskil, which we already mentioned in a different episode, Shir, when he was writing about the Gainim, he already noticed Rabbenu Chananel, as I said, from Rishonim quotes and Aruch also, and he collected and he wrote a lot about Rabbenu Chananel. But all this was based on Kli Sheni. And everything about him in even the 1830s, as I said, was all through Kli Sheni. What happens is that it gets published in the Shas Vilna, and when it's published, it's unbelievable. It causes the Talmidei Chachamim were fascinated by it. Just to mention, Rameir Simcha Akayim Midevinsk, one of the Gedolei Olam of the past century in the Litvish world. So he wrote a chibur, as Yedua, on the Rambam. Numerous times he brings Rabbenu Chananel Hanitbas Mechadash. One time he says, "Hine beperish Rabbenu Chananel Hanitbas Mechadash mefurish kagirsis Rabbeinu." He's trying to explain the Rambam. So what's the significant thing in understanding it is we know the Rambam had earlier messiahs that go back to the Gainim. So Rabbenu Chananel is as close to the Gainim as we could get. Another place he says, "V'hu Shitas Rabbenu Chananel b'Perushay." Another time, Dar Sameach says, "V'zeh Perish Nifla Lamdeinu Rabbenu Chananel V'zeh Perish Rabbeinu," and this is also pshat in the Rambam. So, when I came across this many years ago, I was actually shocked how many times he brings it down, and he brings it down many times. Interestingly enough, he's not the only Litvisha Gadol who's using him at this point in time when the Shas film is coming out. I just mentioned the Tshuva Zichron Yonason. I just mentioned Amud Eish. They also handle with it. The Netziv, who interestingly enough, in the Shas film is coming out in the 1880s. It comes out, and the conclusion is 1886. The Netziv already only has a few more years of being active, so most of his writings has been written already. We still find him using Psachim, Rabbenu Chananel, HaNitbas from the side of the Gemara. So you see that the Litvish Gedolim are using it often. Mishnah Brura, 120 times, at least according to searches, uses Harach, Rabbenu Chananel, HaNitbas Mechadash, and to help him in understanding the Sugya. Now, what is the significance of Rabbenu Chananel? So we're not going to spend a few episodes on Rabbenu Chananel at this point. I'm just going to quote as follows. I mentioned that Shir was the go-to place to talk about Rabbenu Chananel was Shir. Afterwards, what happened is that a lot more discoveries. After Shas Vilna, there were major discoveries with Rabbenu Chananel, and they from Gniza fragments and stuff like that. So Bam Levine, Rabbi Yam Moshe Levine, which we will get to Mir Tzashem, more about him, but he, in his collection of his work called Eitzer Gainim, he has a special section devoted to Rabbenu Chananel, because it's a Messiah of Gainim, and in many of the volumes, there's a special section of new materials not in the Shas Vilna. Now, so what's so significant? Once we have from these new materials that, as I said, Shir doesn't have, did anyone really write up about him? So in the 1990s, Shraga Avramson, the great Litvish Talmid Chacham, who was also a Lamjer Talmid Chacham from Lamjer originally, but he was a professor in Hebrew University, and he was an expert in Gainim, and he put out a whole book on Rabbenu Chananel. It's printed in the 90s, but it reads more like a card catalog. It's fascinating to read. It's printed by a regular from press, Vakshal Maznayim. I think it even might be available till today. More recently, a good friend of mine, Yosef Dubrovik, wrote a doctorate on Rabbenu Chananel, where based on all the new materials, which we have much more actually from when Shraga Avramson was cataloged, new discoveries. As a matter of fact, this Dubrovik has published through Vakshal a whole new Rabbenu Chananel on Shabbos and some other Masechtas, and he wrote a whole doctorate about it. And he writes, the doctorate is to show the Chashivas of Rabbenu Chananel. So it's not so. Just to quote 2-3 sentences, it's the first running pirush that we have on Bavli. In this pirush, Rabbenu Chananel deals a lot with pirush amilim. He translates strange words in Aramaic, Arabic, Greek. Sometimes he also sums up a lot of times the halacha. He brings down Gainic material, and he also talks about Gainic material. So he's a great messiah for Gainic material, and most importantly for many people is he brings a ton of Yerushalmi. Okay, so the significance is a lot of times all of a sudden you also will preserve a girsa. So all of a sudden you're looking on the side of the Gemara, you're taking for granted that they always had it. No, it's only from 1880s and onwards this chibur, which gets into the Mishnah Brura, etc., etc. Now, Just to mention two more pratim about this, I came across a while back, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, as well known, had a Maggid that came to him, however this Maggid works. And this Maggid says, when it's talking about the Rambam, I'm translating based on the Hebrew translation. The Maggid of Yosef is in Aramaic, but here it says, Yaduash Teidash, a kol divrei Rambam al roiv heim emes. Kiven shu nidbak begirsais shel Rishonim. It's based on girsais of Rishonim. Kegoin Rabbenu Chananel v'Rabbenu Hai shegirsasam brura. So we see how significant the girsais of Rabbenu Chananel are. Also, to understand the Rambam, this is already a Maggid of Yosef, so I have not really seen that quote. I came across this. Anyway, point is, this was used, etc. Just one other makar is you have a Rav Elia Kaplan wrote a mahalach how to make a new pirish on Shas with the multiple parts. Throughout his sample throughout this write-up where he writes how one should go about writing a pirish and learning Shas, he has all different examples. He also shows different pieces of this Rabbenu Chananel recently printed, helping in different sugyas. Anyway, bottom line is, how does this come to exist? How does it get published? It gets published through the help of the Diktukei Seforim, which eventually we will get back to him also. Now, who is the Magi of this Chibur? Reb Shlomo Kayin, one of the Gedolim of Vilna at the time. He writes specifically in Psachim and other places how he's the Magia, and it seems also, and okay, anyway, fine. Now, it's at the end of the day, Chazon Ish points out more than once, more than twice, that he says as follows: V'chein reisi b'lashon Rabbenu Chananel hanitpas b'tfus reim, aval lo yadanu im efshel l'smoich al nitpasim michadosh. Why? So, and then he talks about this, he says what we will get to about it, but he says that there's a problem with the hatakas of the chibur, and that there's a lot of mistakes crept into it, so to speak. Okay, this is what the Chazon Ish writes more than once, more than twice, and we will get back to it. Now, but as I said, I'm going to quote the Chazon Ish to give us more also about the significance of Rabbenu Chananel as it's quoted in the Rishonim. So the Chazon Ish is the Chazon Ish in Baba Kama. He says, we find very often the Rishonim, when they refer to Rabbenu Chananel, they say Divrei Rabbenu Chananel, him Divrei Kabbalah. So what's going on? He says, "What the Chilo Yomer Rabbenu Chananel Davar Misvar." He never says anything Misvar. Rak Mashakibel v'chein Rabbi Chol Rabbi Seinu Aravina v'chulu. Elavade Kulam Kiblu Mashakiblu v'chidshu Mashachidshu. Kilgon like Kol Rabbi Seinu Rishonim. He also is mechadish like Rishonim. Ali Harba Pama Paiskim Cholkam Rabbi Chananel ve'in Chayishishim. So it can't be like that. What's going on? He says, Rabbenu Chananel Shimish Gadol Echad Shayizikaron b'Yoser v'Yizakan b'Yoser v'Kibel Mene Harba Dvarim. The Chaveira b'nei Dair lo Yadam v'Huzal Hayim Masaper Dvarim shekibel lefnei Chachmei Dair Dvarim nestarm u'mafliyim. V'zeh noisan loy chashivis miyuchedes sha'adairis haluchim u'musmatim u'mishu asher b'uvdas harishonim yesh by kedusha yisera v'chachmei yisera. But to argue on him al smach rayis breweries, that was you could do, but that's what it means is that when the Chazon Ish is explaining that he's a certain chain, a link back, and that's the truth. We see this very much is he's a link back to the Gainim, and that's what helps make him so significant. Anyway, just to wrap up two more sentences about him. I mentioned in the past that there's been printed as letters between Reb Avigdor Nebenzahl and Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So in one of the letters, so Reb Avigdor Nebenzahl writes, based on a rach that was just printed, you could be miyashiv or sameach, who I said already. Anyway, he's into Rabbenu Chananel. So then we find here, Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, no, it has nothing to do. What you want to bring is not at all relevant to the conversation. He doesn't see what you see. I don't see what you see in this Rabbenu Chananel. Okay. And this Rabbenu Chananel plays, and just to conclude with one last point, one of the editions of Rabbenu Chananel that's come out as its own footnoted edition, so in the Hagdama it says that one of the Paiskei Dairenu, this is going back 20 years ago, says something that based on a Rabbenu Chananel, it would, in a certain situation, it would be usher to do a Mila on Shabbos. Now, so Rabbi Moshe Lipschitz writes, this could be found in a Sefer HaZikaron that was put out l'chvaydai. Basically, he writes that it's not telling you who this gadol is, but this gadol was none other than Rosh Zalman Auerbach. Means that Rosh Zalman Auerbach was chayshish mamish halacha l'maisa, like this Rabbenu Chananel. Okay, so bottom line is that we're seeing is that we're actually seeing the Chazon Ish actually gives us understanding in Rabbenu Chananel as the way Rishonim bring it down, but as the newer version of Rabbenu Chananel, all these manuscripts I mentioned, Chaim Kanievsky, the Mishnah Brura, and various Litvish Gedolim went with that. The list could go on and on, but we have to move on.
Okay, a couple things before you move on. Where were you reading from the Chazon Ish that you were quoting? Where is that?
So this is Chazon Ish and Baba Kama Siman Yud Aleph Ois Chaf.
Okay. Also mentioned as you were speaking, so you mentioned that Ramei Simchan Har Sameach quotes is very fond of the Rabbenu Chananel. Then you mentioned the Maggid. I remember when I was in yeshiva, you told me the same thing, that the Rambam was very connected to the Rabbenu Chananel, right? They said a lot of the Mekayros.
Right.
You mentioned two.
Right.
Was that something that was a skabel like that?
So that always was in skabel. I mean, say way back without even using the Maggid of the Beis Yosef, the people have said it. So, but they were only using a Rabbenu Chananel, let's say, that the Rashba will bring down once in a while. But here, the Chiddush was now we have a ton more material. So, yeah.
Okay, two more names. You mentioned a bunch of names, but I think two names. You mentioned Avram Elia Kaplan. Very quick biography on him. I know he's someone who's you probably have a lot to say about him, right?
It's not l'chvayde to mention him in so quickly, but he's a fascinating character, which we hopefully have to get back to one day. So
that's what I was pointing out. It's in a different realm than a lot of other names that you mentioned.
Right.
And Shlomo Kayin, he said that the Vilna Maggid, he was the Mechaber of.
This is the Binyan Shlomo.
Not the Vilna Maggid.
The Dayan of Vilna, which also needs his own.
Dayan of Vilna.
He also, which I actually quoted him in the last episode, that he was very into printing of Rishonim, knowing the printing dates and everything of Rishonim in his introduction to Isser Seforim. So here, one of his jobs, he didn't get enough of a salary being a Dayan. He worked as a Magia for the Tfus Vilna. He was amongst other people that worked there.
Okay. Excellent. So let's move on. I know you want to speak about, so far you mentioned Chaim Kanievsky and the Mishnah Brura, a little bit of Har Sameach, but, as you've done many times in your other episodes, is give a historical context, of how things developed. So please fill us in historically, where we see even earlier manuscripts of other Rishonim that were being used by, let's say, other Gedolim throughout the generations.
So I want to give an example. This is a name that everyone knows from pretty much in the beginning of when one begins learning Gemara Rashi Taisus is Rabbenu Tam. So when you learn Taisus, a lot of times you hear, "Is this the Rabbenu Tam or Sefer Hayashar?" What's the story with this Sefer Hayashar? So interestingly enough, again, Taisus quotes it, other Rishonim quote pieces from it, but when does it come? When do we actually have the Sefer? Turns out in 1811 is the first time a printed version of the Sefer comes on the market. The Sefer, when it comes out, has Chashav Askamas from Ramar Tchabanet and the Chassam Sefer, and it's put out by a Dayan in Pressburg, someone that was very makurv with the Chassam Sefer. It was Rav Daniel, I forget his last name right now. Anyway, it's put out. Okay, fine. Now, so you'll say, was it used at the time? So the answer is, interestingly enough, that Reb Ephraim Zalman Margolis wrote a chibur called Hayashar, which he held was full of corrections and biurim based on the Sefer Hayashar of Rabbenu Tam that just came out. And throughout his writings, he uses a keseder. You could even find he'll mix in the middle of a Aguna Shaila, he'll somehow mix in some yediyah that he found in this Sefer Hayashar. Now, Sefer Hayashar of Rabbenu Tam is worthy of a few episodes, but in Bekitzer, it's Rabbenu Tam's Torah. It has Chedushim, it has Chuvas. There's a lot happening in the Sefer. And Baruch Hashem, our Dar, Muzaicha, someone just came out, just to show and tell. David Deblitsky, who's famous for putting out many Rishonim, he put out 2 fat volumes. One is the Sefer Hayashar, this is the Chuvas, and then he has Sefer Hayashar, this is the Chedushim. He based on the manuscripts that was made available to him, a lot of work. They actually used the Eitzar Chachma forum sometimes when they had a problem, and they would put up a tshuva, and people would write in, and they thank it in the introduction even. This is a real frum person, son of the great Rav Shlomo Deblitsky, frum guy. I don't even know if he knows how to use internet too much, but his son did this, and this is a modern technology of Bnei Brak. using the internet, using a forum. Anyway, that's not many thanks it in the Hagdama, so he doesn't even hide this piece of information. Anyway, so Rabbenu Tam, it was zeicha to a book recently from Professor Rami Reiner, all about Rabbenu Tam, specifically about the Sefer Hayashar, and we're not going to go into what the significance of the Sefer is, but if it's a Rabbenu Tam, we can imagine it's going to have significance just to help even Sugyas and Taisus as it's brought down. Anyway, so Rabbi Ephraim Zalman, I said, wrote a chibur, somewhat of corrections. The Diktukei Seforim says that he saw it. He saw it. He describes it as being a big chibur. The Chassam Sefer tells Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolis, who was a good friend of his, that he should give it over to this Dayan and Pressburg. Maybe if he releases it again, I don't know if he did. But it seems that later on, at the end of the 1890s or something, when the Sefer Hayashar, part of it's reprinted, this person writes that he did have Rabbi Ephraim Zalman's material. Today we have the edition of Rabbi Dubutsky is based on more manuscripts and better job than the editions that were available. Anyway, so now this Sefer Hayashar, we see the point is here you have that the Chassam Sefer and the Chassam Sefer also use it. Rabbi Ephraim Zalman goes and uses it, and then you will find in the literature of numerous Litvish Gedolim and others, Svardish Gedolim also. It's basically now on the market and it's being used. So here we have another example of the point is it's a mainstream Rishon, so that could, when we get to the Chazon Ish, it might be a different thing. I did not check if the Chazon Ish Lamaisa ever quotes it, but the Chaim Kanievsky, Avada, uses it in the Chuvas that are related to his work. So that's another example of a mainstream Rishon that people don't realize. It only came to existence in 1811. Now, from 1811 till the 1890s, the edition was a very hard edition to use. Chassam Sefer even points out that the Ksav Yad that they got it from, whatever, it's very hard to read. Anyway, that's another example. Okay. Now, for the next example that I would like to give, this is a very fascinating example, as we'll see, and that is the Shiltos. Now, the story of the Shiltos, how it gets onto the market, actually, we have already recorded an episode about this that we will hopefully release in the next month or two, but which deals a little bit about it. But we're going to focus now on is that in 1861, and because I have the first print, we have to do show and tell, the Shiltos in 1861. I have to get my money's worth of owning the Sefer. That's the excuse that some people have of owning first prints, is they get to be able to show it in a shear or something. So I was just able to be yaitz a little bit. Anyway, so the Netziv puts out Hamek Sheila on the Shiltos. Shiltos is an early work. We're not going to get into the significance of the Shiltos, but we'll call it for a Ga'inik work that the Netziv writes, a massive parish. Today it's 3 massive volumes. It comes out from the years 1861 to 1867. So now, okay, so he puts out a work of the Shiltos, this work of the Shiltos. What's significant is as follows. You open up the introduction, you start seeing that not only does he have what was printed in 1786 from Rabbi Shai Berlin, he got manuscripts. Now we have to keep in mind who's the Netziv. The Netziv is a yeshiva of what's called the Harvard of yeshivas, a Volozhin yeshiva. So he describes in the beginning of his work the following thing. He describes that he spent a lot of money and he bought a manuscript. From more than 400 years ago. Okay. Then he talks about how he finds Legalois Nuskhay Sefer Rabbenu v'Hizmin Lafana Be'ir Minsk Pirish Ksav Yad al Shiltos, and he gets hold of that and uses it. Okay, great. So we see him using manuscripts of the Chibur. So it's not just that he's putting out what Rishai Berlin did with his parish, he's using manuscripts and he quotes throughout the work. Then all of a sudden, later on, he writes, still in this Hagdama, he starts talking about that he finds out he describes how you start to seek out through the various libraries if there's more manuscripts of the Shiltos, if you get copies. Anyway, then he writes who he wrote to, etc. Then he writes as follows. He found out that in St. Petersburg they have a Ksav Yad of the Shiltos. He says, I didn't sleep until I went there myself to get this Ksav Yad, and he uses this Ksav Yad. He brings whole pieces from this Ksav Yad. He says that there's materials in here that are not elsewhere, that are not in the other editions, and he uses it, and it's incorporated in this Shiltos. Now,
describe for the audience what does it mean that the Netziv was in Volozhin going to St. Petersburg to track down Ksav Yad and the Shiltos?
Okay, so just to make it dramatic, one has to be a drop entertaining. So the way to make a drop entertaining is as follows. Imagine if I told you that whichever yeshiva you learned in, imagine you're learning in Panovich, and Rav Shach finds out that there's a new Ksav Yad of the Ramban, let's say. Would you picture him going to get on a plane in the middle of the Zman and go to America or St. Petersburg, for that matter, to go look up a new Ksav Yad of the Ramban because he's working on his Avi Ezri? I don't think so. Well, I don't know if you could point to any Rosh Hashiva. Now, the Netziv, besides for being an incredible person, he was known for, he signs even this Hagdama, almost Bavoid. He didn't waste a second. He was known legendary Hasmada, crazy Hasmada, not against other Rosh Hashivas, Chas v'Shalom. He's beyond prolific. Here we have the Rosh Hashiva of one of the greatest yeshivas taking off to go to there. Now, in those days, it's not like you got on a plane and you go fly. I actually reached out to someone to try to figure out how long would it take the Netziv to go from Volozhin to St. Petersburg. So he basically wrote to me a whole answer, and he even told me how he could probably get the exact answer. But bottom line is, it takes a few days. And there's no direct way. There was no direct train from Volozhin to there. And the point is, I didn't spend the exact time to give the exact number. But the point is, the Netziv is doing this again for what? For a manuscript of a Rishon, a Goyin, actually, to get whatever he could to put out the best edition based on what's available to him to publish. Okay, now, so here we have another example, another precedent. Now, what's interesting is his brother-in-law, the Aruch HaShulchan. What's less known, we just spoke about the Sefer Hayashar. What's less known is the Aruch HaShulchan put out an edition and a beer on par of the Sefer Hayashar. So also the Aruch HaShulchan of Volozhiner also did such a thing. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this as follows. In 1928, something happens, which is a manuscript starts coming out of the Ramban. Now, materials of the Ramban came out before, but in 1928, Reb Isser Zalman Metlzer starts publishing a set. I believe I don't have a set, but I believe you have a set of the old-time Rambans. You usually only find it in Shemus these days. Some people keep it. The Vakshal has it still in their they still sell it even, and it's known as Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer's Ramban. But what does that mean? It's Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer's Ramban. He wrote Ha'aris on it? No, it's much more than that. Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer writes out in length that he printed even some manuscripts. He got a hold of some manuscripts of some Masechtas that were never published before. He also took Tyrus Adams and put them in the right places. That means, say, if the Ramban wrote in Tyrus Adams something that's relevant to Brachas, he put it in the back. If it's relevant to Gittin, he put it in the back. And he wrote Ha'aris on the Sefer. Now, these Ha'aris also are legendary in the world of Ha'aris. They say that a lot of times when they today we have better manuscripts or more manuscripts than Ramban, he was mamish on the mark. He was mechaven to the Dakas Lashon of the Ramban. Okay. Is Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer. One of my points I would like to make is, where does Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer, great gadol, tremendous gadol, get this from? You know who's a Talmud of? He's a Talmud of, amongst others, the Netziv of Volozhin. This zach of printing and being interested and making available Rishonim from manuscript, none other than one of the greatest Rosh Hashivas of the past hundreds X amount of years, is the Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer. So much so that people even said to him, "Why are you wasting your time?" He held it was a Meiri schus. He held that was only because of that schus he was able to put out his Even Azel. Anyway, a lot more to say about it, but just to keep it brief and as it relates to us and our story. In his Hagdama already, he throws out an idea. One of the ideas he throws out is that if you have my Ramban that I have on Megillah that I'm publishing, I believe it's from the first time, you'll see that there's a shiloh that comes up often, that the Chaim Sefer paskins a certain way. The Chaim Sefer only paskins because he had the Ramban through the Ran. If he would have my Ramban, he wouldn't say what he said. Then there's another piece. This is a more famous story, and we're going to say it very briefly, and this relates to another topic where Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer says a similar type of thing, and that's as follows. L'maisa, some Ramban started coming out on the market from manuscript in the 1700s. Some came out. It seems the Yeshuas Yaakov saw one on one Masech on Shabbos. Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer says, his copy must not have been great, or mistakes crept in. I'm putting out a better edition, but it had a chashav askamas, including the Chaim Sefer. But that's Ramban on Shabbos. But Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer is printing certain ones for the first time. Now, One such Masechta is Masechtas Megillah, I said, with the Chassam Sefer now. It's another story which relates to the Chassam Sefer, and that is, without getting into the Sugya Shabai, but the following thing is, when one goes to Shul on Rosh Chodesh, we're about to hit Rosh Chodesh, so there's a question of how to lane. And there's the way most shuls lane, and then there's what's called the Gra Minhag, which is all based on how to learn the Sugyas of Megillah Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph, Amud Beis, and the Gra over there in Shulchan Aruch, Taf Chaf Gimel, brings down the Ramban seems to have a certain issue with the Sugya, and the Gra says Lamaisa, he brings down a Masechta Seforim. He says one should do like the Masechta Seforim. That's the maskana of the Gra, and therefore the Gra comes up with a different way how to lane than we do. Now, first of all, like this, he has a Ramban. The answer is he brings it based on how did someone have the Ramban throughout the generations? The Ran. The Ran brings down a Rajba and the Ramban, a Meiri on the Sugya, and he has a big piece, I'd say 15 lines or something. Now, the Ramban does not, in the way the Ran does not talk about Masechta Seforim at all in this Sugya. So, l'chayra, when you're looking at the Sugya, what you have is there's the Gemara, whatever Shilos that come up in the Gemara. There's a Ran, which is Meiri the Shilos B'Shem the Ramban, and then there's a Masechta Seforim that comes along the Gra, who we know from other places, very into earlier sources, and Masechta Seforim, and then he says to go not like the sack of the Shulchan Aruch and the maskanas of other people, and go like this Masechta Seforim. Okay, now. Obviously, a lot of material, a lot of ink has been spilled to understand this Gra. You have the Mishkanas Yankiv, you have Rebbe Lezer Moshe Horowitz, you have the Netziv, all these Gedolei Lita trying to understand the Hanhaga of the Gra. This Hanhaga of the Gra it's not only in the Bir HaGra, Meiser, this is how it's brought in the Meiser Raf. The Tshuvas Chassam Sefer has a tshuva where he deals with this sugya also. Seems someone brought to his attention this Hanhaga of the Gra based on the Masechta Seforim. The Chassam Sefer says, I look up the Masechta Seforim. It doesn't say, even the Gra that he's bringing the Masechta Seforim, it doesn't say what he says it says. So he says a lashon like this. Higia kiritzainai kidarkai. That the Gra changed girsais like he wished, kidarkai. Means it's a common thing that he did. Interestingly enough, this sounds like a very sharp lashon. So Mark Shapiro noted already that in some later editions of the Chassam Sefer, this stark lashon kidarkai has been edited out. When I was looking into the sugya now, I see Mechon Yerushalayim when they bring down the Tshuvas Chassam Sefer on the side, when they talk about this Gra, they write you this Chassam Sefer, and they also take out the word kidarkai. Now, at the end of this Tshuvas Chassam Sefer, the Chassam Sefer says, "V'chol hamashana yadei al tachtoina." If someone goes like this Ramban, it's mamish, it's yadei al tachtoina. He says. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of times you can find.
If you just want to clarify, is it Masechta Seforim or the Ramban? How do they connect?
It's both. The Ramban. We're gonna get to it. Up till now, we have that the Gra is basing a new Hanhaga based on his reading of the Masechta Seforim. That's Adkan so far. I mean, say we don't know the Ramban because the only thing that we know about the Ramban is how the Gra had it based on the Ran. The Ran supposedly is bringing down a Ramban. So the Gra is arguing on a Ramban and passing like in Masechta Seforim, which the Chassam Sefer is saying is based on his girsa, how he's changing around this Masechta Seforim. But we don't get to the Ramban yet. We're about to. Okay, now, which is a Keseder happens is other people, when they hear sometimes a Gra, they react differently. So the Aliyas Eliyahu brings down a story from the Ksava Kabbalah that he heard, that basically Rabbi Akiva Eiger and Rabbi Zechariah Mendel, they were together, and someone told them over someone told them over this Gra, and Rabbi Akiva Eiger's reaction was, someone ran to show it to him inside. Rabbi Akiva Eiger's reaction was, really, we should do it. The Gra seems to be saying, what the Gra seems to be saying is correct. He says, okay. The other person in the room said, Lomais is going to cause problems of Loisis Gaidadu. Says the Aliyas Eliyahu that why, but the Chassam Sefer, he brings down the Chassam Sefer, the Aliyas Eliyahu. He's aware of the Chassam Sefer. He says, why is he saying Meshana Yad al Tachtaina? Because we know the Chassam Sefer was was battling opposition of Shinuyim and Tefillah, so he was more sensitive. Lamaisa Rabbi Akiva Eiger was also, so I don't know why the Aliyas Eliyahu thinks it's Rabbi Akiva Eiger. You see, different people react differently to different things. Anyway, what does this all have to do with our discussion? Says Rabbi Zalman Metlzer, after you have my Ramban, you see that the Gra is not so powerful anymore. Why? Because when you he says as follows: open up the Ramban that I published, and you'll see that the Ramban knows about the Masechta Seforim, and he has a different gears than the Masechta Seforim, and he handles the Masechta Seforim. He handles the whole sugya. He's aware of all the problems of the Gra, and interestingly enough, the Ramban, when he talks about this sugya, he says lemaisa, not to go be meshana the sugya, not to be meshana like, even though possibly whatever the Masechta Seforim, keep the minig as it is. So it's mefurish that the Ramban was aware of the Masechta Seforim, and there's much more than the way the Ran has it. So why am I using this example? So now, first of all, Rabbi Zalman says, as the Vilna Gaon, the Ramban was the first time on Megillah was only published at the end of the Gra's life, so most likely he didn't see it. This is Rabbi Zalman says as a har. Other people, such as the Bir Halacha, also says the Bir Halacha was crazy into the Gra, the Mishnah Berurah and Bir Halacha. Over here in this sugya, he doesn't go like the Gra, and he says what? Lamaisa, we have this Ramban. The Ramban is Messiah, not to not be Mishana our minig, which is not like the Masechta Seforim. Okay. Rabbi Grozensky wrote an incredible Sefer on Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, Makari Kodesh. He also says he didn't have the Ramban. Now, earlier I mentioned there's a tshuva sefer from Zichron, Gevaldige tshuva sefer Zichron Yonason. He brings down a whole arichos, 5-6 page tshuva, Gevaldige tshuva, where he explains the Gra. He says the Gra is the best in the whole sugya. It's the best gear, so everything. Lamaisa, he also says, because he also had the Ramban, we don't change it because of the Ramban. Okay, now, but what I'm trying to bring out over here is here you see part of the significance of the story of what I'm trying to tell, which is sometimes we have a Messiah of said Rishon, the Ran's bringing it down, but the Ramban the Ran is only bringing it down in 15 lines. If you look inside the way Rabbi Zalman prints it, it's 2 pages. There's much more material, and he has all the different things similar to what I said that the Mishnah Berurah and others point out on the Magen Avram with Dar Zarua. Once you know that Daki Moshe had Dar Zarua and we have Dar Zarua, a lot of times questions are answered. So there's a major significance in having the specific Rishon, seeing it in its context, and it could be a game changer in Mamish understanding the sugya. Now, just to point out a few more pratim with this to wrap it up, like this. First of all, Rabbi Yoina Metzger told, Rabbi Yoina Marzbach told Reb Kalman Kahana when he's talking, he also wrote about this Gra. He also knew a lot of this material with this Ramban, and he says it could be. It's not that Rabbi Zalman doesn't say that if the Gra would have seen this, he would have been chayzer. He might have reevaluated this thing, but the point is the Chaim Sefer was wrong also. But the Vilna Gaon, it could be, would even still hold based on his, however he worked, which is a whole different discussion. He held that this Masechta Sefer to Mishana the Nusach, and he would even still argue on the Ramban. I'm not convinced actually over here, because over here we have, what's significant is once there's a Ramban that's handling the Masechta Sefer and is saying it's much different. The Gra would be more mityaches with it, but whatever. This is a different conversation. But what's interesting is how are people naik? So most people, including, as I said, the Mishnah Berurah says to be naik like the Ramban and not to change it like the Gra. So the Chazon Ish, what does the Chazon Ish do over here? Chazon Ish, we know, is very into the Gra. So interestingly enough, the Chazon Ish, this Sairei Reb Kalman Kahana writes this. Sayin, the Sefer of there's a Sefer put out by the Greinemans called Dinim Van Hagas B'Marana Chazon Ish, also says as follows: B'Kriyas HaTorah, he would do Deloi Kahagra. So the Chazon should do not like the Gra. Says the parentheses, V'Shamanu Sha'amar Sharamban Al Megillah Terem Nitvas B'Zman HaGra. It wasn't published in those times. It was the new manuscript to the Ramban. V'Ilu Ra'ya Meiri, and so much so is the Chazon Ish held that the Gra would have been Mishana and held like this. Reb Chaim, there's a Sefer, I recently found out about this, Minhagim of Basic Knesset, Letterman, which they published the Minhagim. Who wrote the Ha'aris? Reb Chaim Kanievsky wrote a lot of Ha'aris. He says, not like the Gra, we do it. Why? Because of the Ramban. This is what he explains. That this is the minig of the shul. This is where Reb Chaim Kanievsky was. So we see that this Ramban is playing out. Interestingly enough, Luach Eretz Yisrael from Rav Tukashinsky, they go like the minig of the Gra. Now, this is just a time to throw out for a second that Reb Zevin already points out that the weird minhagei agra weirds that become so big is gufa through the luach of Rav Tukashinsky. But here you see, and even in the newer luach, what's called the luach, the standard luach now in Eretz Yisrael, taking over the luach of Rav Tukashinsky, and they even have it published. They even have a published American version, so they bring down both minhagim, and they say it seems like the yeshiva. They quote in their aris that yeshiva shalom is to do like the gra. Okay, whatever. Anyway, bottom line is one more point about this, and then we'll just conclude with one other idea: is that Reb Shrei Deblitzky, another granik, he taka and his shul did like the gra. The Ramban, and a Talmud of his put out a beautiful Sefer, volume 1 so far, called Derech Yashar, Meiri in the Sugya, similar to what Reb Yoiner Marzbach told Reb Kalman Kahana that maybe the Gra would have said differently. A whole arichos that Avada the Gra would have remained with his Shita, even with the Ramban about it. And this is in the 10-page piece about it. Okay, now just to Messiah, one last idea relating to the Ramban. What one of the points already is that we're seeing is even the Chazon Ish Ramban he's using it's a new manuscript according to this Messiah. Okay, now we're still in Daf Yomi of Nadarim. So in the discussion of Nadarim, we mentioned that the Chida saw in his travels the manuscript of the Ramban's work on Nadarim with the Nemuki Yosef and the Ritva. He saw this Ksav Yad, and it gets published in the late 1700s. So interestingly enough, the Chaim Sefer found out about it. He has a beautiful letter about one of the reprintings of this. He says he found out about it through a Talmud of his, and Baruch Hashem, he was Zeicha when he was Zachiti Lilma Mesechnes Nadarim Yeshiva. I got a hold of this Chibur, which had in it the Ritva, Muki Yosef, and the Ramban. And it's unbelievable. Okay. Now, but the point is, this was a new chib. Yet again, we have the Chaim Sefer being using a brand new printed from manuscript and using it. So too, Rebbe Kiva Eger says, my son-in-law, the Chaim Sefer, told me about it, and it's Murdik, and they're both giving us skama for a new printing about it. Okay. Interestingly enough, in a letter in 1827, the Rebbe Chaim Zalman Golos writes to his friend the Chaim Sefer, "You wrote me a shtickle Torah relating to Nadarim," and he says, "I noticed you have in your hand a Piskei Halacha Shel Ramban al Nadarim, and also a Ritva. Asher lo zachisi lerois miyamai. Please tell me how to get this." Now, Ki Yadua, Rebbe Chaim Zalman Golos was a crazy Seforim collector, and a crazy Seforim library. He sees the Ramban using this new manuscript. He's like, where did he get this from? Please make sure, hook me up with this. I didn't hear about this. Okay, and so, but the point is, here we're seeing yet again that it's not just the Mishnah Brura and Chaim Kanievsky. We're seeing the Sefer Hayashar is a story from the 1800s. We're seeing again with the Shiltos, with the Netziv, Rosh Hashiva of Alajin. We're seeing with the Ramban. We're seeing not only the Ramban on, let's say, Megillah, but even the Ramban and other Masechtas that's only coming out of manuscript in the 1800s. The Simcha, the Chaim Sefer saying he's able to use it for saying Shir, writing a shtickle Torah of Zalman. Anyway, we see this, and Amir Hashem, we hope to in the next episode to continue more, to give even more context to this story.
Incredible. Just remind me, when I was in Yerushalayim, when I learned there and lived there, standing in Yerushalayim is to go like the Gra, right? Are there places that go not like that?
I don't know. I think that a lot of places do not. I think more and more now, not everyone does go like the Gra in Yerushalayim anymore. But I don't know. I didn't take a poll.
What do they do? What do they do by you?
I think they don't do like the. I think they do like not like the Gra.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to continuing this conversation.